The sound came at dawn, rolling low across the grassland like thunder that never fully broke. It was not the roar of strength that stirred antelope to scatter. It was fractured, almost unfinished, carrying more ache than authority. The rangers paused in their patrol, listening again. The cry rose once more, hoarse and ragged, and they turned toward it, boots pressing down the brittle stems of the dry season plain. The lion lay where the grass thinned against a patch of bare soil, a shadow of what he should have been. His mane, once heavy and proud, hung in faded strands, thinned by weeks of struggle. Each rib stood sharp beneath the skin, the rise and fall of his chest shallow, as though every breath was an effort. His head rested on the earth, but when he saw movement on the horizon, his ears flicked once, tired but alert. The men kept their distance, crouching in silence, letting the moment settle. The lion tried to lift himself, pushing against the soil with trembling legs. For a moment he managed to rise halfway, his shoulders heaving under the strain, but then his weight folded back down with a sound that was closer to a groan than a growl. His tail lay motionless behind him, the tuft twitching only once before stillness returned. Around him, the land told its own story. The rains had failed weeks earlier, and the plain bore the memory of thirst. Dust coated the thorn shrubs, the grass brittle and scattered. Few hoofprints marked the ground. Prey had moved on, following the distant scent of greener pastures. For a lion left behind, the emptiness had become a sentence carried in his body. The rangers watched his sides move, a shallow rhythm that revealed how close hunger had pressed him toward collapse. He turned his head slightly, golden eyes dim yet unbroken, fixing briefly on the figures that stood across the dry grass. The gaze was not fierce, but searching, as though instinct still wrestled with exhaustion. One of the men spoke softly, his voice carrying like a whisper across the space. "Easy, boy," he murmured, though he knew the words were less for the lion's ears than for his own steadying. The sound drifted, gentle and unthreatening. The lion blinked slowly in response, then lowered his head once more to the soil. Flies gathered at the corners of his eyes, and with a faint flick of his ear he tried to push them away. His body gave small tremors, not from cold, but from weakness that reached deep into his muscles. He licked his lips once, the rough tongue dragging slowly, as if even that small effort drained him. The men exchanged quiet looks, their silence carrying the weight of recognition. This was not the proud figure who ruled the plains with thunderous roars. This was survival, pressed thin, an animal at the edge, calling out with the only strength he had left. The broken roar had been both warning and plea, echoing across the grass until someone listened. They did not move closer. Respect held them back, knowing that even in frailty the lion deserved space. But they also knew that this morning's sound marked the beginning of something they could not turn from. His struggle had announced itself to the plain, and to them. The lion shifted once more, rolling weakly to his side. Dust clung to his mane as his chest rose and fell, slower now. The broken cry had faded into silence, but its echo lingered in the still air. The rangers stood watching, the sun lifting higher over the plain, carrying with it the quiet truth. The fight for his life had already begun, and they had arrived at the moment when it could no longer remain unseen. The lion stirred as the morning warmed, the sun climbing higher and pressing its heat across the brittle plain. For a long time he lay still, the rise and fall of his ribs shallow against the earth. Then, with a faint shudder of effort, he began to move. His forelegs reached forward, claws stretching into the dust, muscles trembling beneath skin that clung too tightly to bone. He pushed once, faltered, then tried again, his breath rasping through dry air. For a moment, he managed to lift his chest, his mane sagging around his neck. His back legs struggled to follow, but when the weight came down upon them, they gave way. He folded back into the earth with a dull collapse, his body too frail to carry even itself. The sound he made was not a roar, not even a growl, just a low, strained moan that seemed to bleed from his chest. His sides heaved and his head turned slowly, scanning the land. The eyes that once held a golden fire were now clouded, the light in them dimmed by weeks of hunger. Yet they still searched, flicking over the grassline, the distant scrub, the empty horizon. Instinct pulled him to look, to keep seeking, though nothing answered his stare. The land itself mirrored his struggle. Once it had thrummed with life, herds scattering like waves before the hunt. But now the plain carried silence. The rains had ended too soon, and prey had followed the water's promise to far-off places. The ground was cracked, littered with thorn and dust, the scent of antelope and zebra long since vanished. For a lion left behind, there was nothing but space and the slow unraveling of his strength. The rangers stood in quiet, their eyes following each effort of the great body before them. They knew the story etched in every movement. Weeks without a kill. Nights spent wandering on legs that weakened with each step. Days when the sun gave no shelter, only heat that pressed down while hunger hollowed him further. Every rib told the tale, standing sharp like scaffolding beneath skin. The lion tried again. His front paws dragged forward, pressing against the soil, claws digging in as if he could will himself upright. His back legs shook with the effort, thin muscles straining. For a few seconds he lifted halfway, his head swaying unsteadily above his shoulders. His tongue flicked over dry lips, a slow sweep that left them cracked and glistening. Then, with another collapse, he crumpled once more to the earth. Dust lifted and settled back across his mane, clinging to the strands. One of the men spoke softly, barely above breath. "Hold on, boy," he said, his tone more prayer than command. The lion's ear twitched faintly at the sound, but he did not lift his head. Instead, his tail shifted once in the dirt, the movement slight but real, as though acknowledging that he had heard. For long minutes he lay motionless again, only the shallow rise of his chest proving that life still held him. The plain stretched quiet around him, not even birds breaking the stillness. The men felt the weight of the moment pressing in, the vastness of wilderness watching one of its rulers brought to the edge. The lion's eyes opened again, slow and heavy, and he turned his face to the horizon. It was the gaze of instinct still alive, though his body betrayed it. His stare reached far, to places he could no longer walk, to prey that would never return in time. The emptiness was written in every angle of his frame, each bone beneath his skin declaring the truth. He was starving, yet he was still trying. The sun drifted higher, casting his shadow long and thin across the cracked soil. Around him, the land lay still, a mirror of his decline. His breath came shallow. His strength nearly gone, but his will to rise had not yet vanished. In the silence of the plain, the lion remained, frail but unbroken, his body failing, his spirit still caught between endurance and surrender. The lion lay still after his last failed attempt to rise, his breath shallow and uneven. Dust clung to his mane and coated his flanks, making him seem almost part of the earth itself. For a time the men stood quietly, allowing the silence to rest between them. Then one of the rangers stepped forward with a deliberate slowness, his hands low at his sides, holding nothing that might startle or threaten. In his other hand he carried a canteen. He paused at a safe distance, tilting it gently so that a trickle of water fell onto the ground, darkening the soil. The sound was soft, almost hidden by the dry wind, but the lion's ears caught it. They twitched faintly, swiveling toward the noise. The ranger crouched low, pouring another slow line of water, then pulled back to wait. The lion's head shifted. His tongue passed over his cracked lips, slow and labored, before he let out a sound. Not a roar, not even a growl, but something smaller, a broken moan. It carried no threat, only exhaustion. His tail gave a faint flick in the dust, then stilled again. The men exchanged brief glances. Speaking in low voices meant more for reassurance than conversation. "It's all right, boy," one said, the tone steady, as if calm could be shared. The words were not meant to be understood, only to soften the air around them. For long minutes the lion did not move. The water sank into the earth, leaving only damp patches in the soil. But then, with a slow turn of his head, he pressed his nose closer to the ground. His nostrils flared, catching the faint scent of moisture. Weakly, he pulled one paw forward, dragging his body a little closer. His chest heaved with the effort, but he did not stop. Step by dragging step, he brought himself to the edge of the damp earth and lowered his tongue. It was not the deep, steady lapping of a strong lion at a river's edge. It was tentative, halting, interrupted by pauses for breath. Each drag of his tongue against the soil gathered what little water clung there. The rangers watched silently, the sight filling them with a quiet ache. He was surviving, one drop at a time. When his strength faltered, he pulled back and lowered his head into the dust again. His eyes closed for a moment, then reopened, cloudy but alive. He shifted his gaze toward the men, not sharply, but with a dull steadiness. They felt the weight of it. Not aggression, but something caught between instinct and need. One of the rangers crouched again, his voice low and even. "Easy. You're safe." The lion's ear flicked once at the sound. His body gave a faint tremor, but no roar followed. The broken cries from earlier had dissolved into this, low moans. Softer, almost pleading. The rangers knew it was a change, small but important. He was no longer pushing them away with his voice. He was simply enduring. The men stayed where they were, giving space, their movements measured, their tones gentle. They knew that trust in such a moment was not won through force, but through patience, through presence that carried no harm. The lion, too weak to rise, seemed to sense that. His tail stirred once more in the dust, a quiet gesture that spoke more than sound. The plain around them remained empty, the silence broken only by wind and breath. Yet in that stillness, something shifted. The lion had accepted their nearness. His roar, once ragged and defiant, had fallen into quiet moans that held no warning. It was not surrender, but a fragile thread of trust, forming between the broken strength of an animal and the watchful calm of those who refused to leave him. The lion lay in the dust, his sides lifting with shallow effort, when a rustle came from beyond the thinned grass. At first, the rangers thought it only the wind, a soft stirring through brittle stalks. But then the movement deepened, deliberate, uneven. Heads turned, watching carefully as another form stepped hesitantly into the clearing. It was a lioness. Her frame was no stronger than his, her flanks hollow, her shoulders sharp beneath her coat. Each step she took was unsteady, her legs trembling as though every inch forward was a question of whether her body could carry her weight. She paused often, lowering her head as if to gather the strength to go on, then lifted it again, her eyes tired but steady. The rangers exchanged quiet looks, their expressions shifting as understanding began to take shape. The roar they had followed that morning, the fractured cry that carried both warning and despair, had not been only for him. It had been for her. The broken voice of the lion had been calling not just out of his hunger, but out of the bond that kept them tethered through suffering. The lion raised his head slowly when she appeared. His ears twitched, his eyes narrowing faintly against the glare of sun, then widening with recognition. He gave no roar now, only a low rumble, faint and strained, as though his chest could no longer hold the full sound. She answered with a small moan of her own, soft and breathless, and took another step toward him. Her paws left shallow prints in the dust. She moved with the same weakness, her tail dragging behind her. Flies clung to her thin frame, gathering at her eyes and shoulders, but she seemed to pay them no mind. Her focus was on the lion, her head tilting once as she closed the gap between them. When she reached his side, she lowered herself carefully, folding down into the soil so their bodies touched. He turned his muzzle weakly toward hers, resting it briefly against her neck. The men stood silent, the scene before them pressing into their chests with a quiet weight. They had thought they were watching the decline of one great animal, but here was the truth. His suffering was shared. The hunger had not hollowed only his body, but hers as well. Together they had endured, dragging themselves further into weakness with each passing day, too frail to hunt, too bound to each other to separate. The lioness shifted slightly, pressing closer, and the male gave a soft grunt in return. Their gestures were small, but they spoke of closeness that hunger could not erase. The rangers could see it clearly now. The cry that had carried across the plain had been both an expression of pain and a call of devotion. Even in starvation, he had called out, unwilling to let silence swallow them both. One of the rangers whispered, his voice hardly rising above the wind. She was here all along. The words carried no surprise, only the heavy recognition of what it meant. This was not just one life at the edge, but two, bound in frailty and trust. The pair lay pressed together, their breath shallow, their eyes half closed against the glare of day. The plain around them was barren, silent, without promise of easy rescue. Yet the presence of the lioness changed everything. The male was not only enduring for himself, but for her, and she, though hollow and trembling, had come forward for him. The grass around them shifted in the wind, brittle stalks brushing against one another. The rangers stood in stillness, watching the fragile bond of survival unfold before their eyes. What had begun as a broken roar from a single lion had revealed a deeper story, not of solitude, but of two lives, holding on together against the emptiness of the plain. The rangers knew the lions could not endure much longer. The frailty of their frames, the shallow rhythm of their breaths, all spoke of time running out. Hunger had driven them to the edge, and without intervention the silence of the plain would soon claim them both. Moving with steady calm, the men carried meat from the vehicle and placed it downwind, not close enough to intrude, but within reach should the lions find the strength to move. Then they withdrew, retreating into stillness, their hands resting at their sides. The scent carried slowly at first, weaving through the brittle grass. The male lion stirred. His nostrils flared, drawing in the faint trace of blood and flesh. He lifted his head with effort, a tremor running along his shoulders as he shifted against the earth. For a moment he only breathed, his eyes half shut. Then he groaned softly and pushed one paw forward. His claws pressed into the soil as he dragged himself a short distance. The lioness, lying close beside him, shifted as well. Her head lifted, her ears twitching. She followed his gaze toward the meat, her ribs expanding and contracting with the effort of each breath. Slowly, shakily, she rose first to her paws, her legs trembling beneath her weight. She stood unsteadily, swaying as though the ground tilted beneath her, before lowering her muzzle and giving a faint moan. The sound drew the male to try again. He pulled himself forward, inch by inch, until at last he managed to rise to his haunches. His mane hung low, his tail dragging as he staggered toward the food. Each step seemed fragile, as if it might end in collapse, but the lioness stayed near, pausing often, waiting for him to gather strength. Together they made their way toward the waiting meal, their frail shadows stretching long in the afternoon light. When they reached the meat, they paused, their bodies pressed close. For a moment neither moved, as if uncertain whether they still had the strength to eat. Then the lioness lowered her head and began, tearing gently, almost cautiously, as though she feared her body might reject what it longed for. The male followed, his jaws closing over flesh with a weak but steady pull. It was not the fierce, commanding feast of healthy lions. It was slow, halting, interrupted, often by pauses to breathe, by the need to gather energy for the next bite. Their ribs brushed together as they leaned close, eating side by side in silence. The only sound was the soft tearing of meat, punctuated by the faint huffs of their strained breathing. One of the rangers whispered, almost to himself, "That's it. Take it slow." His words drifted away on the wind, unnoticed but steady, a quiet encouragement for a struggle that was not yet over. The lions ate little at first, their bellies too shrunken to hold much, yet every mouthful was a lifeline, a thread pulled back from the edge of collapse. The lioness paused often, lifting her head to rest it briefly against the male's mane before lowering it again to eat. He accepted her weight, leaning faintly into her as though the closeness gave him balance. When at last they pulled back, their muzzles darkened with blood, they lay down together once more. Their sides rose and fell more deeply now, the rhythm less fragile. Their eyes closed not in defeat, but in the weariness of animals who had at last found a moment of relief. The rangers stood at a distance, silent, their presence no longer needed. What mattered was unfolding between the two lions, frail bodies finding strength enough to share a meal, each bite a borrowed chance at survival. The plain was still, the grass bending lightly in the breeze, as the pair pressed close, bound by hunger, bound by endurance, and for now held safely in the quiet grace of life returning. The afternoon softened as the heat of the day began to ease. The lions rested side by side, their bodies pressed close, muzzles stained faintly with the blood of the meal they had shared. For a time they lay without movement, their breathing heavy but deeper now, no longer as shallow and broken as before. The land around them remained quiet, the wind weaving gently through the brittle grass, carrying the faint scent of dust and dry earth. Slowly the lioness stirred. She shifted her weight, her paws pressing into the soil as she tried to rise. Her first attempt failed, her hind legs trembling beneath her frame, forcing her back to the ground. She waited, drawing air into her chest, then tried again. This time she managed to stand, unsteady, her body swaying as though the earth itself tilted beneath her. The male watched her, his head lifting slightly, his eyes following her every movement. He pushed against the ground with his forelegs, claws scraping at the soil, dragging himself upright. For long moments his body resisted, quivering under the effort. But with a final heave of his shoulders, he stood. His mane hung heavy, his back curved with weakness, yet his paws found their place beside hers. The pair leaned toward one another, their sides brushing as though balance came only through closeness. The rangers watched from their distance, silent, hands resting at their sides. They did not call out or move closer. This was not their moment to shape. It belonged to the lions. They had given food, they had given water, but now the choice to rise belonged only to the animals themselves. The lioness took the first step, her paw lifting with effort before placing down softly in the dust. Her stride was short, careful, each movement deliberate, as though she feared her body might falter if she moved too quickly. The male followed, his pace matched to hers, his head lowered, his mane brushing against her shoulder. They walked slowly, their shadows long in the falling light, each step measured against the weight of their weakness. At times they paused, their bodies trembling, their breaths uneven. They leaned into one another during those moments, their sides touching, steadying each other. The lioness would glance back at the male, her ear twitching faintly when his stride faltered. He would respond with a soft grunt, low and strained, yet filled with persistence. Together they pressed forward again, one step after another. The rangers followed at a respectful distance, careful not to push or intrude. They spoke little, their words carried only in whispers when needed. "Stay strong," one murmured softly, his voice meant only for the air. The lions did not hear the words, but the sound itself felt like a thread of hope laid gently across the space. The plain stretched ahead, vast and bare, but the lions did not falter. Their movements grew steadier with each passing moment, the food they had taken lending them fragments of strength. Though still fragile, they walked with a determination that belonged not to hunger, but to survival itself. Their paws pressed into the soil, leaving tracks that crossed together, two sets of prints aligned as they moved as one. The sun began to sink lower, its light softening into gold that washed across the land. Shadows deepened, stretching long and delicate behind the pair. The lions walked into that glow, their frames silhouetted against the horizon, fragile yet unbroken. The roar that had carried pain that morning no longer filled the air. In its place was silence, but it was a silence that spoke of endurance, of a fight that had not yet been lost. They reached a rise in the land, a small slope where the grass grew slightly taller, and there they paused once more. The male lowered his head, panting heavily, his sides heaving. The lioness pressed closer, her flank against his, her muzzle brushing briefly across his mane. He leaned into her touch, his body trembling, before lifting his head again to face the horizon. Then, with steady breath, they continued forward. The rangers stood still, watching until the pair began to fade into distance. They did not follow further. This was where their part ended. What came next belonged to the lions alone, their journey back into the wilderness, guided only by the rhythm of their steps and the fragile strength they had regained. The sun slipped lower, turning the horizon into fire. The lions' shapes grew smaller, their movements slow but unyielding. They leaned on each other, bodies brushing with every stride, their silhouettes merging into one as the light deepened into dusk. The broken roar that had carried across the plain lingered only in memory now, its sound etched into the silence. It had been a cry of pain, of hunger, of devotion, and it had been answered. The rangers knew they would remember it, not as a warning, not as a threat, but as a reminder of how survival sometimes came in the quietest, most fragile forms. As the final light spread across the plain, the wind stirred the grass in gentle waves. The lions walked on, fading into the horizon, their forms swallowed by the evening glow. The land closed behind them with silence, carrying only the echo of what had been. And as the sun dipped away, the memory of that broken roar remained, breaking hearts and leaving behind the quiet grace of gratitude.